Thank you for calling CAA Dispatch. Your call will be recorded and may be monitored for accuracy and service quality. To help us better assist you, please select from one of the following menu options. For GTA,
Change it to be, please excuse Look, being put on ignore. Hello, it's Dave, G33, driver number 209, call
Hey,
51297.
Yep.
There's a little bit of an issue with that call.
Gonna tell me.
Got no.
Not here, no place, not much, look all over. Not here, no car, no number.
I thought it might have been the gray one sitting here, but somebody got in it and drove away, so that's not our car.
So you're not seeing a colored car, plus you're not seeing that license plate.
Nope.
Let me see if I can get this number here. Member will be on the driver mat and do unlock. Park outside of Cambridge Center Mall. Great. How big is Cambridge Center Mall?
That's where I'm sitting. It's a big place.
No.
They got Sport Checks in here, the Galaxy, Indigo Kids. You just don't have my car here. And the geotag.
Give them a quick shout.
Yeah, the geotag shows them showing up over here at State Main Kitchen and Bar, but the car's not even in that location.
But it doesn't even say where exactly, does it? I'm not seeing.
Just outside this mall.
South side?
Well, that's what it's supposed to be, is in the parking lot here somewhere, but I've gone from one end to the other end and checked out these little, like Applebee's here and over there, and
Alright, let me give this person a quick call just to give them a last chance.
Yep.
Hang on, Dave.
Yeah. She's got them on it. We ought to ignore doing that. The wiper blades will come back unignored.
Dave.
Yep.
Okay, so I got the member. She said she's still inside. So she said it's by the food court entrance.
That's like telling the blind man that it's over by the black shadow.
She said she's coming right out. So if you want to head over to the food court side, I don't know
wherever that is.
I don't know. Maybe where there's some food signs, fast food place sign, I don't know. But she is gonna head over to this side of food court entrance. Yeah.
I wish they'd tell you, food court entrance is on the north side of the building, the south side of the building.
Let me see if I can pull it up on Google and see what's up. Oh, man.
that's a restaurant, but that don't look like a food court. Court? No, that's not a food court.
You think you found it?
No.
Right. Okay,
That place is definitely locked up.
Food court would be off of the Bay or Cambridge Eye Center, where Sports Check is.
I don't think she's even on the Hesper side of this. I just found more parking that I didn't even know about. And they're numbered.
Yeah, around by Conestoga.
All this parking's numbered even. This is lot number 4. I didn't even notice that till I would come around. There's flags stuck up with numbers on them.
Huh. Yeah, I think the food court is around by the Conestoga, around that side. That would be close to, where Cambridge Eye Center is. Somewhere around there.
I'm gonna guess this lady standing out here is our customer.
Probably.
That one over there.
I asked her to go out.
Keys are with us still? Alright.
Found her?
Yep.
Okay, beautiful. Alright.
And she said the car's stuck in the middle of these other cars. Nice. I don't think it died while it was driving. I think it just won't start. Because it's nosed in a parking spot on the back side of this building. It died while it was driving. It would be hard for it to get to where it is, would it not? Oh, even the plate matches on it. That's nice. Now the fun part, right? Alrighty. Thank you.
Alright. Okay, cool.
Talk to you in a bit. Bye.
No problem. Bye.
I love my Jeep. I love my Jeep. I think I've already fell on my ass once. I'm going to scoot this way, just like that. We're gonna go back on ignore.
Thank you for calling CAA Dispatch. Your call will be recorded and may be monitored for accuracy and service quality. To help us better assist you, please select from one of the following menu options. For GTA...
CAA Dispatch, Steve speaking.
Hello, it's Dave, G33, driver number 209, call 51297.
51297, what's going on with that one?
Well, I think we need to send a bed over here. It would just be easier for everybody.
Yeah, let me...
It's an unattended.
It's an unattended? Okay.
Unattended.
Yeah, I can get that cleared off you here since it's an unattended. We can... Yeah, we can set it up just for whenever. So I will duke that up for a flatbed, and then I'll get you cleared off here.
I've got 12 rims.
12 rims? I'll add those in. Okay.
It's a no start. Car does go into neutral.
Does go into neutral?
Oh yeah, it does go into neutral, but you won't get it to start in park or in neutral. I think she's got a battery issue.
Okay, I'm going to save that up, and it'll need a flatbed as soon as we can get someone out there.
Mention to the driver that if he's going to be walking around the car to be careful because it is like a sheet of ice.
It's like a sheet of ice?
Yeah,
Oh.
I tried pushing it and did a face plant.
Oh, wow.
At least I tried.
Put one... Yeah, that's... It's very icy out there. Let me just put a note in there saying... Okay, I put a note in saying be careful because it's icy, and I'll get... I didn't finish clearing yours. Okay, should be cleared off you there now.
Alright. On my way to the next one.
Yeah.
Alright, talk to you later.
Yeah. And if anything pops up with the next one, just give us a call back as well.
Okay, thank you.
Because it is pretty bad out there right now.
As long as they're on snow-covered roads and they're not that bad, it won't be too bad for me.
Yeah, as long as they're not buried in snow so you can't load them.
I got a shovel. I don't mind working to get something done if I have to. But alright, I'll talk to you later. Try to have a relaxing time.
Yeah, try to stay warm out there.
Alright, thank you. Bye.
Take care.
2018. One of those things where we have to do something and nobody wants to help. That's why coming here is that I normally have to clean up a mess. And look at Timmy's V-Train trailer.